This is it. I'm finally launching a YouTube channel. Hi, I'm James Williams and I love tinkering around with Microsoft 365 and especially the Power Platform. In these videos, I hope to share with you how I've overcome various challenges that I've met while using the Power Platform. And in so doing, hopefully you'll learn something and have a bit of fun with me along the way. If you like these videos, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I hope to be posting many more videos to come. In this first challenge, I want to try and build a Power Automate flow that automatically scores a quiz that's been built in Microsoft Forms. So a quiz is a particular type of form that you can build using this new quiz button at the top of the Forms portal. And when you do that, as well as choosing your question titles and your question answers, you get this option to add points to each question. And then when the recipient of the form comes to fill in those questions, they have to try and choose the right answers. I'll just quickly put in some demo answers in this. And then when they come to submit their form, they can view their results. And you can see here that Forms has scored me on various questions. So here on the choice question, this multi-choice question, this short text input question. And then for some questions, it's not scored me. And that's pointing out here that this is going to be manually reviewed by someone before I get my final score. The ranking's also been auto-scored. So then what you might also have noticed in Power Automate is that the Microsoft Forms connector is very limited. It has one trigger and one action. And the trigger, when a new response is submitted, doesn't give as much information about the form or the response at all. It gives us the ID of the form, which is this long string, and the ID of each individual response. In addition, it gives us the time that that form response was submitted. So to get any more details about a particular response to a Microsoft form, we use the get response details action. But even in this action, even though we can see now the answers that that particular recipient gave to the quiz, we don't see what their score was. So in this video, I want to build a Power Automate flow that does calculate the score automatically for a quiz received from Microsoft Forms. And the goals for this challenge are that this quiz scoring flow will run as a child flow. This means that the flow is reusable, and all a maker has to do is build a parent flow that uses that Microsoft Forms trigger. So when their responses are received, that will trigger their parent flow, and that flow will call this quiz scoring flow as a child flow, and that will give them the score for their recipient's quiz response, no matter what that quiz was. We also want it to score any question type that Forms itself would calculate the score for. So any of those questions that we saw earlier that when you finish the quiz said would be manually scored later, we're not going to tackle that in this flow. This is going to replicate the ability of Microsoft Forms to score quizzes. We're not going to use a manual marking scheme. This is going to be form agnostic. Any quiz that is submitted to this child flow will be analysed and a score will be produced without any extra steps being implemented or any marking scheme being implemented per form. This means that if the form questions change, no going back to that marking scheme and updating that as well will be necessary. And finally, I want to try and achieve this with no apply to each loops. This is mainly for performance reasons. If this flow is going to be called for every response to every quiz, then it's got to be really efficient, and apply to each loops are a real problem for efficiency in the Power Platform, so we want to avoid those where possible. I also wanted to try and do this challenge without using any premium connectors. While I think this might have been possible until recently using the SharePoint HTTP action, that's recently been restricted so that you can't use the SharePoint HTTP action for Microsoft Forms any longer. So we're going to have to use the HTTP with Entra ID connector now in order to read the data we need to from Microsoft Forms. So jumping over to Power Automate then, because we're going to use a premium connector, I'm in a developer environment. This is a developer tenant, so I don't have a Power Automate premium license associated with my user account. So we're going to have to use this developer environment to build and test out this flow. But if you're running this in production, you will need a Power Automate premium license for that premium connector. So first, we're going to go to the solutions pane, and we're going to build a new solution for this flow. So I'm just going to call this quiz scoring demo. Just use the default publisher, and then I'll click create, and that will create my solution, which is what we need to do in order to get these flows working together as parent and child flows. So here I am in my new empty solution, and the first thing I'm going to do is build that child flow. So if I go to new, automation, cloud flow, instant, I'll call this quiz child flow, and use the manually trigger a flow trigger and click create. This is my new child flow. I'm just going to add quick compose in here. And I'm going to put some basic input here, click save, and that's my child flow saved. So if I go back out of the child flow, we'll see that that's now there in my solution ready to go. If I click back into this and click edit, we now get the nice new designer, which is what we're going to use to build out this flow. So the next thing we're going to do is add some inputs to this child flow so that the parent flow can tell this child flow all the bits of information that it's gathered from that Microsoft Forms trigger. And as we saw, those pieces of information are the form ID and the response ID. So I'm now going to save that by publishing this child flow. And now that that's saved, we're going to go back to our solution. We're going to build the parent flow. So if I go to automation, cloud flow, automated this time, because this is going to be the automated flow that runs when a new response is submitted to our quiz. So I'm going to choose that trigger. We'll call it quiz parent flow. So eventually you'll have loads of parent flows that will call that child flow, and each of them will receive a score for whichever quiz triggered that response. So the first thing we're going to do here is choose the form from the drop-down list. So I've built a form here that has all the question types built in, and that's how I figured out which question types can be auto-scored by Microsoft Forms. So I'm just going to use that as the form, and then I'm going to go to call my child flow from here. So I'll type in child flow. Here we are, run a child flow appears. So if I click that, I'll be able to select my quiz child flow. And then I can see that those two inputs I asked for have appeared. So we're going to first of all put in the response ID, because that's being shown to me as a piece of dynamic information. And if I hover over that, you can see that it's getting the trigger outputs and then looking for the body resource data and response ID. We saw earlier that the form ID was also there, so what I'm going to do is copy this and paste in as an expression. I'll just get rid of the extra symbols around there. So this is that existing expression. I'm just going to change the word response to form. And that's it. So now we've got a parent flow that is triggered when a response to the quiz is received. That will run a child flow, which is the child flow that will do the scoring, and it passes on that form ID and the response ID for that particular response. So I'm going to save this now. I've already come across an error, which is that I can't use this child workflow because I'm missing a response action. So if I go back into my quiz child flow and edit this, I need to build in a response. So if I use the respond to a Power App or flow action, you can ignore the fact that it comes from the Power Apps connector. And I'm going to add an output, which for now is just going to be text, and I can put result. I'll put TBD in there. Eventually we're going to put the score that the user, that the recipient achieved in this box. If I publish that, and then hopefully I'll just be able to save this, and there we go. The flow is now saved. So I've got my parent flow completely set up, and that's all we'll need to do for this flow. So back in my quiz in the forms portal, this is the all question types quiz I set up. So the questions that Microsoft Forms can score itself are these choice questions where you have one correct answer, choice questions where you've clicked multiple answers are allowed. So here I've selected 2 correct answers out of the 3 possible answers. A text answer. So there's 2 possible correct answers I've put in for this question. And you'll notice that if you select long answer on a question, the option to add correct answers disappears. So in fact, this can't be automatically scored by Microsoft Forms. So I'm just going to set the points back to 0. The rating question also can't be auto-scored. Neither can a date. Ranking can be auto-scored. So these are the 4 options in the correct order. And if the user replicates that, they'll get the point. It's worth making these ranking questions required, because otherwise, if the questions are already in the right order and the user doesn't do anything to rearrange them, actually no response comes back to that question, so they wouldn't get the point. So if they actually need to click on the question to fill in an answer because it's required, then that will stop that eventuality happening. Leica doesn't get auto-scored, neither does a file, neither does NPS. And then I've also added a section break into this form just to make sure that the flow deals with that appropriately. I'm going to quickly fill this form out and hopefully get the full marks. Correct one. So the only other question with a score is the ranking. 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm going to submit this form. So if I click view results here, I can see that Forms auto-scored me 4 out of 4 points. And if I go back into my solution and click quiz parent flow, I should be able to see that that flow is run. There it is 19 seconds ago. There's the 4 minutes ago one where my recording cut out. But if I go into this 19 seconds ago run, I'll see that the response was submitted. And in the outputs to this section, we can see that our form ID and response ID came through. And we passed those values on to the child flow in the form of these 2 parameters, text and text1, which are the parameters that the manual trigger automatically gives titles to. And then also, if I click in the outputs of this, we should see that my result, TBD, was fed back from the child flow to the parent flow. So what we want to do now is amend that child flow so that this becomes the 4 out of 4 result for this form. So how do I do that when all I've got is the form ID and the response ID. But in terms of getting the information about the form itself and the points available to each question, we know that the browser does that when it opens the form for editing, because we can see here how many points were associated with each answer for each question. So our browser must be doing something here to get all that information from Microsoft Forms. And we can see what that is by pressing F12 and opening up the developer tools for Edge here. So as long as we're on the network tab, what we can do is refresh the page here and see what calls the browser is making in the background to Microsoft Forms in order to get the relevant information. And what I'm hoping to do is steal something from here that I can reuse in my Power Automate flow. You can see that's still churning away there, so I'm going to click stop recording because I know all the information I need must be somewhere in this top section because it's already showing me on the page what the point values were for each question. So for each of these calls that's going on in the background, we can see if we click on each one what the URL of that request was. So this is the request to get the design page for this particular form, and there's my form ID that I've seen from my Power Automate trigger. And we get to see a response as well. This is a preview of the page. It's not loading properly here, but this is the structure of the page that I've requested. And then the browser goes on to request more things, and we can see here that there is one to an endpoint called forms where it's passing in my ID, or at least some ID. If I see here that this is that form ID that Power Automate had. But before it gets this far, it's for one accessing something that looks to be the Forms API, and then it's passing on some other IDs. So there's an ID here, there's a user's part of the URL, then there's another ID, and then light, and then forms, and then we get to our ID which we've obtained from the trigger. We can see that that's the end of that particular URL, and there's some extra details here which is where the browser's asking for specific columns to come back from the results. So there's a lot of things here, but if I click on preview to see what response came back, I can see that in here we've got a section called questions. If I click into here, I can start to have a poke around to see if there's any information I can use in my flow to score a question. So this, you can see, is to do with that file upload question. We know that that one didn't have an auto score available. So if I now go to the next one, that's a matrix choice group. I don't know what that is, but we'll move on. Text field. So this is potentially one of the questions that had a score associated with it. Question ranking. So here's one we do know had a score associated with it. And in that question info box, we can see that there's a grading basis, which seems to have various IDs in it. That might be helpful later on. We can see that there's a choices part of the question. So this looks like the options that I gave to the recipient to choose from or to put in the right order for this ranking question. The text field. So this must be, yeah, this is our short text answer where we did give some correct answers. So we'll have another look in this question info line. Here again, we have a grading basis, and it's got some IDs, and it's actually given the values of the correct answers in here. So that's going to be useful to us. Question choice. So here's one of the choice questions, and we can see in here that in this question info box, we've got a choices property, so not grading basis. There's an answer that's one of the available choices, and there's this property called is answer key. So potentially that's telling us that is the correct answer. Answer key is true for correct 2, and there's the incorrect answer, for which there does not appear to be the property is answer key true. So it looks like for the choice type questions, we do again have the means to score the question. However, it's not exactly the same. It's not got that grading basis, it's got a question info. This is the single choice, so there might be something different here. Again, we've got the correct answer and his answer key true. So it looks maybe like we can treat these choice questions in a similar fashion. So that's really good. So what that's given us there is the ability, if we could come up with this URL, to get the points associated with the questions for our form. So we just have to figure out how to do that from just the form ID, because there's a lot more to this URL than just that form ID. So the other thing we need is to get the response. So what we want to do is, again, look at what the browser's doing when we look at the responses for a given question and see if that is another method available to us for getting those responses. So I'm going to open the developer tools again. And in here, I'm going to click the responses tab, because I know that then gives me details about responses. In fact, if I go into review answers here, so here I'm drawing down at the bottom to call cold responses. So if we have a look at this, again, we're using the form API and we're using those IDs that don't come with the Power Automate trigger. There's the ID that is coming from the Power Automate trigger. So far, this is exactly the same as the other. In fact, this whole bit is exactly the same as the other URL we found to get the questions, except at the end here we've got /responses. If I have a click preview, we can see that there are various responses here. So there's 12 rows there, and it looks like, yes, there's more than 12 here. Oh no, sorry, there's a 0 here. So there's 13 responses in my list from this API, and I've got 13 responses available to me here. So if I look at this last one, this is that latest version of my quiz where I filled in the response. There's not much in here, but you can see that there is an answers section that seems to show the answers I gave. So it's got question IDs that will hopefully help me tie it back to which question's being answered. The answers that I gave, we'll do some more analysis of this later, because this will probably vary by question type as well. But it's good to know that that's there. But we've still got this problem where we don't know how to generate this forms API call from just the form ID. So how are we going to do that? Well, one thing we know is if we want to send out this form to someone, we'll send out this link. And using that link, they can fill in the quiz. And all that link has in it is the single ID, which is the ID of our form that is returned from the Power Automate trigger. So hopefully the browser is doing something with this information that pulls back those other IDs that it can then use to calculate the question scores and get the responses. So again, I'm going to open the developer tools on the network tab. I'm going to go to this response page with the ID. And it's loaded the page, so I'm going to stop the recording there and have a look what's going on. So I can see initially that it's called that page. This is all, again, that kind of outer page goodness. Nothing there it looks like I can use. Then it's going to this response page startup .ashx endpoint. So that's still just using that form ID, which is useful. And then in this response, it's returning a lot of information. So if I potentially search in here using Control F for form API, here it looks like there's a couple of properties I can use: prefetch form URL and prefetch form with responses URL. And it looks like it's building out at least the first part up to the word light of that URL I needed. So if I added forms, was it after the end of this, and then included the ID, I should be able to use a combination of those two to get all the information into my Power Automate flow from the Forms API. So here I am back in my child flow, and I'm now thinking about how I'm going to pull in that information from the Forms API into this child flow. Now, it used to be, until recently, that you could use the SharePoint HTTP connector action. So this send an HTTP request to SharePoint until recently worked with the Forms API. However, that's recently been restricted, which is unfortunate because this was not a premium connector. But the one we now need to use instead is the HTTP, if I scroll down here, with Microsoft Entra ID pre-authorized connector. Unfortunately, this is a premium connector, so you will need a Power Automate premium license in order to run this flow in production. But we can use this to make calls to the Forms API. So if I click here, invoke an HTTP request, because I've got no connections set up to my to this connector in my environment, it's asking me to create that first new connection for this connector to use. So what I will do is I will first go back to one of those forms pages, and I'm going to take that first part, maybe just run up to the .com, that first part of the request URL, and I'm going to copy it to my clipboard and then come back to my flow and use that as the base resource URL. And in that box too, and if I press sign in, it's popped up a sign in window. If I click through, it's now accepted that. So that's set up to use a connection here. And it's ready for me to tell it what method I want to use and the URL, which is great. So just as a test, if I take this whole URL, copy it to my clipboard, go back into my flow, also notice there that the request method was get. So if I replicate that in my flow here, so that's just all hard coded for now, but it will serve us to use as a test to see if this works. So if I publish this flow, now do a test, so manually. So there it's asking me for that connection. So now I can paste in that form ID. My response ID was 13 from memory. So if I run that flow, obviously it's not using those parameters yet, but I should be able to see in the results whether or not this request was successful. So if I look at the outputs, I can see that I've got all that information that came back from that endpoints, and somewhere in here, hopefully, is that form API, at least the first part of that URL for the form API. So that's brilliant. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a note of where this was. So it was in body server info. So if I just open a notepad, I've got server info, and then prefetch form URL. So that should give me a link like this. And if I scroll along, I can just capture, in fact, I'll capture the whole of that row and I'll put it in my notepad. And I can see that I want to take all of this first part of the form, the URL, up to, and I think including that liked word at the end. And then I'll replace the bit that comes afterwards with whatever I need for my specific request. And now with that done, I'm going to just rename this request at the top. If I go back to edit the flow, that is, I'm going to call this get form. And I want to replace this static ID with the dynamic one. So I'll delete that one out. And I'm going to insert some dynamic data here. So from my trigger, from my manually trigger a flow trigger, I've already asked for the form ID. So if I put that in there, this should now pass on that form ID to this URL and get me that full response. And what I want to do after that is amend this compose action, and I'll call this form base URL. I need to put an expression in here that will generate the first part of that URL for those subsequent calls to the form API. So to do that, I'm going to use a Power Automate expression. In here, I want to get a substring of the response from that HTTP call, so the body of get form. Particularly, I want that subproperty, which was server info prefetch form URL. So if I just copy that to my clipboard, use some square brackets and a single quote, I can paste in that additional part of the path in that object to the property I want. So I want a substring. I can see there's one extra bracket in there, so I'll just get rid of that. I want the substring of this property starting at the very start, so from 0 to I need to find out which character it is where that /light part of the URL comes in. So I can use index of to do that. Returns a subset of characters from a string. That's substring index of, open my brackets, returns the first index of value within a string. So again, here I want the body get form server info prefetch form URL. And then as the second parameter, I want to look for that light bit of text. So this, if I run that now, so if I look what's come back from the form base URL, it looks like it's got all that URL up to 466. So if I go back and look at one of those other requests to the form API, I need that form ID, and then I can start using the correct endpoint for the task I want to achieve. So if I go back into my flow, I've got my substring there, so I'm going to add back on that light, flows, curly brackets, the two quotes, and then for my dynamic content, I'm going to add form ID and save. Right. So next we're going to call those two APIs. To do that, I'm going to copy this action and I'm going to paste it in down here. First we'll do the question, so I'll just rename this to get questions. So this is the one that will bring me back the points associated with the correct answers. So let's have another look at the form API that was used by the browser. So it was this really long expression or URL. This was to bring back all those various columns, and we don't really need any of this. We probably only need questions in the middle there, which I see at the end here is expanded so that it also includes the choices within that question. So if we trim this down, let's delete all of that except for questions. So we're just selecting that questions data back from the API. And if we leave in and expand, we don't need permissions or permission tokens. We just want the choices within those questions. So we've got our base URL here, which goes all the way up to the closing brackets. So in theory, all we need to do is add this bit on the end. So if I copy that to the clipboard, go back to edit my flow, in my get questions, if I delete the whole URL out, what I want to do is use my dynamic base URL here and add on the end just that extra bit. So now if I publish this and do a quick test, I can see that's failed. So why is that? And I see the reason is I've put flows, not form, my base URL. So let's edit that again, like forms, publish, and this time it has succeeded. So we have a look at the outputs. You can see we've got questions and we've got question info, which is very promising. And within the questions, we've also got choices, except not on that one, it seems. Oh, here's one with choices. So it looks like from question to question, that might vary. Or maybe there are questions without choices. But overall, that looks successful. So now what we want to do is do the same for the responses endpoint. What I'm going to do is, if I go back to edit this flow, I'm going to add a parallel branch here to make this flow run as quickly as possible. I'm just going to choose any action here, because what I really want to do is copy this action and paste it in here, and we're going to reuse this. So these two actions, get questions and get questions, get responses, this will be, or get response, will run at the same time, and therefore the results will come back slightly quicker. I'm going to delete that useless action there, and I'm then going to click on respond to a power up or flow, and in the settings tab I'm going to rejoin these two paths into one by also selecting get response here. So this action will only now run when both of these have finished. So we'll add the rest of our actions in this intermediate step here. So we need to now adjust this URL. So the URL we want to use is this one with the responses endpoint. But we don't want to bring back all potentially 3,000 results here. We want to try and get just the one result based off our form ID. We can see that in the response, every value that's been returned has an ID. So I will have further down the list, there's my ID 13. So that was the response ID that the trigger came back with. So if I can amend this URL to just give me back that one response, that would be great. So how do I do that? Or what I've done is I've asked Copilot the question. I've asked Copilot, how can I use a filter expression to just get one response using an API call similar to, and I've taken all of that URL up to responses, and I put, for example, where ID equals 13. And so Copilot's come back with this suggestion where after responses at the end, it says $filter equals ID equals 13. So potentially, if this works with the form API, we can use this to just get one response back. So I'm going to take everything from the /responses onwards, because everything before that is our base URL, and I'm going back to edit my flow, and I'm going to get rid of all of this, the /responses filter ID equals 13. In fact, we won't test it like that. We'll test it with the dynamic response ID from the trigger. If I publish that, here we are, the flows run successfully. So if I check on get response and look at the outputs, I've just got one response in my body and value property. So that's fantastic. So the next thing I want to do is take what's come back in this get questions action, which is still quite a lot of stuff for each question, and trim it down to just the things I think I'm going to use. So looking at this, we're in the body, we're in the questions property here. And then we've got a list of questions returned. So this is one question. What might we need from here? Let's just copy this out to Notepad for now and have a think about that. So all this is null, so we probably don't need any of that. It looks like choices was relevant not for this question, but further down. We had a choices question that had the details of all the various choices there. So we want to certainly keep that. So let me get rid of that. This looks like it's specific to a file upload question. But if I keep going, ID sounds very important. Let's keep that. We don't need to know it's a quiz. We know we're dealing with a quiz here. Question info we definitely need. We don't particularly care what order the question came in the quiz, so I'm just going to delete that. We don't need to know whether it was required. I'm going to keep the title in for now because it's going to help me determine which question was which. I've named them for each type of question, so that's just going to help me. But it looks like this type is going to be very relevant for that too. So we can tell that this question was a file upload type question. That might be it. So if I get rid of the rest of this, that should leave us with just the bits we want. Actually, what I will do is add order back in, because thinking about it, that will help me go through the questions because I know what order they're in now. That will help with the analysis we're about to do. So how are we going to get our questions response written down to just those columns? And the answer is using the select action. So after both of those are finished, I'm going to add at the bottom here a select. And what we want to take the values from is the questions. So if I come in here, I'm going to write an expression. I'm going to get the body of get questions, but also those questions were inside an object called, a property called questions. So if I add that in, so then I want each item in the array returned from select to be an object in the same format as my object here. So if I, in fact, I might just put some placeholders in. Leave it for now. I'll leave it for now. Let's copy those out, paste it in my map. We then need to replace these in fact I will do that. So if I blank all these out for now, put the order back in, I just go back to mapping mode, I can then start mapping these across. So for choices, if I use an expression, so for each item in my array, my input array, I'm going to get the choices property. So if I add that in, I'll need to do that for all of these. So I'll just do that now. So that's those all filled in except for question info, because if we go back and look at the last run at the get questions response, we can see that the question info properties aren't objects themselves, so that they've not got this nice nested view. This is basically a JSON string representation of the more complex object that we want to see. So we need to extract that somehow. So back in our flow editor, we need to add a slightly more complex expression in here. So we still want to retrieve the question info. But this is going to be that JSON string. So we're going to add JSON around the outside, and that will take that string and convert it to a native type value, which is exactly what we want. The only thing we need to be careful of here is if the question doesn't have a question info property, if that's null, which is allowed because we've kept this question mark in here, this JSON expression will fail because a null value isn't a valid JSON string. So we just need to add in a coalesce function here, which will return the first non-null value in its input. So ideally that will be the question info, but if that's not a valid piece of JSON, we will just give it, in single quotes here, an open and close curly braces, which is a very short but valid JSON string, and I'll put that extra bracket in, and then if I click add, that should be the select finish. So if I publish this, that's the right expression, but if I click on text mode, so yeah, it's put quotes back around it, which will reduce it back down to a JSON string. So we want it to be the whole object, so I'll get rid of those quotes and I'll just publish that again. And brilliant, this time question info has been expanded, so we'll be able to access all the properties within that as well. So next we're going to do two things. First is we're going to filter out all the questions that we can actually auto score. And the second is we're going to reorder the questions into the same order that they appeared in the quiz. So to do that latter part, I'm going to have the input to this filter array be I'm going to sort the output of that selector. I'm going to sort it on the order column. So if I add that expression now, that will sort those questions, the array of questions, into the right order. And then I need an expression. I'll probably do this in advanced mode. I need an expression to tell me where the questions are of the types that I am capable of dealing with. So going back to look at the latest output, so some of these will be based on what type of question it was. So we know we can't deal with file upload, but we could deal with question text field type, as long as it wasn't a multi-line one. So this is text long, so this is the question we can't deal with. So we want to allow text field questions, but not where question info multi-line is true. Question ranking we were happy with, so we'll keep that in. All the question ranking, NPS, no, we can't deal with. Question choice we can deal with. That's fine. Date time we can't. And there's question choice again. So we can filter out all the types we can deal with. And the other thing that's probably worth doing is checking where there's a point value here inside of question info, because if there's 0 points available for that question, there's no point in us analysing what the answer actually was. So to save a little bit of time, I've come up with that expression here already. So we're interested where, for one thing, we've got one of the question types that we're happy with. So we're checking the items type property, and we're seeing if that's question.choice, so either question type will be accepted. The question type is equal to question.ranking, or the question type is equal to question.textfield. But if that's the case, it's also the case that the item question info multi-line property is not true. So that will give us the short text answers only. I've also added in here an extra bit which I hadn't thought of before until I wrote this expression. But we also want to make sure that the grading basis isn't empty. So that means on these text field questions, if we haven't provided a correct answer, then we can't automatically grade the answer either. So where we've got a text field type question, we want the multi-line part to be true, sorry, to be false, and we also want there to be a grading basis in order for us to consider answering that question. So we've got one of the applicable types. We also want it to be the case that that question has at least 1 point available to it. So we've got the item question info point property here. In case that's null, we're coalescing it with a 0, and then we're checking with whichever one of those values is returned that isn't null is greater than 0. So if there's more than 0 points available and it's one of our chosen types, and in the case of a text field, it's a short text question and it's got a grading basis property, then we're happy with that, and we will continue to evaluate that in our flow. So I'm just looking here at that grading basis property. So on the short type of text question, that's the only type of question where you can actually have an empty grading basis, because you can have a question that you're going to score manually in theory. So if you don't provide a correct answer, you can still assign a point to that question. Whereas the other questions with grading basis, like this one here, the ranking type question, you have to provide an answer for, and it's got to be in some sort of order. So the grading basis will always be there. Okay, so this is the output for the filter array action. So you can see we've only got 1, 2, 3, 4 questions now, which are the 4 types of questions we said were auto-scorable in forms. So now it's where it gets a bit tricky, because we've got different versions of ways to get to the answer or to the correct answer across these different question types. So here's the choice type questions, and we can see that the question info property has a choices property within that, and within those choices there's the actual choice you can make, but then also this is answer key property is true or false depending on whether the answer is correct or incorrect. So for the single for the question.choice questions, we'll need to extract the choices where answer key is true. It looks the same for the multi-choice questions. Obviously we need to think about the fact that we can have more than one correct answer in here, so this will be an array of correct choices. Then we've got the short text question fields, and there's no choices object here. We've got a grading basis. So in this grading basis, it looks like we've got an ID for the correct answer, and then we've got the actual text for the correct answer as well. We'll probably need to extract those bits of text for the correct answer out to see if it matches what the response contained. And then lastly, we've got this question.ranking type of question, which is the one where you have to put the answers in the right order. Here we've got choices, and the choices here seems to tell us the order that the questions should be in. So order 1 for option 1, order 2 for option 2, and so on, which should be enough to tell us the answer. We've also got a grading basis object, which seems to contain the IDs of those responses, and they're probably in the right order. So if I go to, order 1 is option 1. There's a key there starting 416, and there's 416, and the next one's 5BE. So order 2, 5BE. So it looks like we could use either one here to answer the questions. I suspect since this is already almost an object like the output we want to see, this might be the easiest one to go for. So what I want to do now is amalgamate all these different versions of the correct answers into a unified property, which I'll add to my array of questions that are coming out of this filter. So to do that, we probably have to consider each type of question on its own, but we're going to use another select action. So here, the input to the select action is just going to be the body from that filter, the filter array action. And then this is going to be a very, very complex expression here we're going to have to fill in. So let's start. So the first thing we're going to say is we're going to add a new property with add property to the existing item that has come back from our filter array. So that item is going to be called, sorry, that property is going to be called answer key. So this is going to contain all the various versions of what the correct answers are going to look like. So taking each type of question in turn, the first one we're going to check for is the choice type question. So if I first check to see if the current item is a choice type question, the way I'm going to do that is use if and equals. So if the current item type property is equal to the text question dot choice, then we want to do something here that extracts the relevant property for that type of question. So that's question choice. So what we want is question info choices. What we want to do is go through all these choices and only get the descriptions for these choices where is answer key is true. Now this will get quite tricky because if we're avoiding using an apply to each loop, we can't loop through each of these choices and pull out the description and do a condition to check whether its answer key is true. So the way to do that without doing a loop is to use XPath. Now XPath is a function in Power Automate expressions that acts on an XML object. So the first thing we have to do is take this choices array and turn it into some XML that we can then analyze using XPath. So to do that, if we go back into our expression, we can generate that XML. So if we do XML, now XML expects the objects to be set up in a certain way. So the way I usually do this is to do an add property. So we're adding a property to, first I'll create a completely empty object using JSON and using an empty JSON object. And then the property we want to add to that empty JSON object is called root. So XML always expects there to be a root property in the object it's looking at. So now we've got an object with root. What do we want the value of root to be? Well, in here, we're going to add another property. And again, we're going to start inside this add property with an empty JSON string. So that gives us a blank object. And we're going to add a property to that called, well, let's call it choices, because that's the array we want to pull out of the current item, the property where the question type is question choice. So what's that choices property going to look like, or where it's going to come from is item, and then, oops, I put too many question marks in. If we do the property within the item, so this is the current question, we want to go into question info, and then / choices. So that should give us, with any luck, the question info choices array inside, so just this bit, that's the array there, inside a new object with a property called choices, so that will match this bit, but then it will put this here within an object with a root property. So we'll see root and then choices and then have the array inside it. At least that's what we want to achieve. So that will give us the XML. So if I just leave that as is for now and publish, we can have a look what that looks like. So I've just fired up a test and already it's failed, but it's telling me that's because I haven't got a value to return if the condition is false. So if I go back to my expression, so that's the value if it's true. So I also want something to come back if it's false. So just for now, I'm going to put an empty string in as the alternative. If I republish that, great, this looks a bit more promising. So in this select, if I look at the outputs, we've now got in answer key this content, which is, I'm assuming, the XML object that we want to examine with XPath. But it here is encoded, so I'm going to copy out this long string, and I'm going to go to search for base64 decoder, and then I will paste that in. I'll turn live mode on, I guess. So here, this is what the XML looks like. It's got that root object and then a lot of choices objects. So this is because there's the first choice. So one for each of the choices. So that one I selected there is the correct answer, and then the first one here, the second one here rather, is the incorrect answer. So that represents just this part of the question.choice-type questions answer key, if you like. So now we need to come up with an XPath expression that can extract just the answers that are the correct answers from this array. So let's do that now. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to copy this XML into XPath at xpather.com. So that's the XPath there, and then what we're going to do is try and come up with an expression. Let me just format that so it looks a bit nicer. I'm going to come up with an expression that evaluates this and ideally just gives me back the description where the is answer key is true. So to do that, we're going to start at the root, can't type, and so that you can see has selected the whole root object there. And we're going to go further than that and look for choices. You can see there it's found two choices, but at the moment it's finding both of them. So we want to only select the choices where is answer key is true. So if we write it in this way, is answer key equals true, close the square brackets. Now that's not worked, and I have a feeling that's because of the formatting. So let's just paste that back in as it was originally. Yeah, so when I click format, that disappears. So we're going to keep the unformatted XML in there, but you can now see that it's only selected one choice, and that's the choice where is answer key was true. But we don't want the whole object, we just want that description property. So if I add in description, that will give me just the description property. But the important thing to note here is that what it's actually going to return is this whole object with the description start and finish tags. What we want is just the text from that. So if I do another slash and then text, open and close brackets, when I put this expression into my Power Automate flow, it will give me back an array of correct answer descriptions. So I'm going to take this and copy it. Right, so before I start amending this any further, I'm going to take a copy of this and put it here as the next if, because this is going to be the next question type when I come back to it later. So we'll have one for text field, and then if that's not the case, we'll have one for question ranking. So that's all the different ones we'll come back to later. But for now, let's start adding the XPath around this bit. So we've got our XML. Now XML is going to be the input parameter, or one of the input parameters to the XPath expression. So if I type in XPath here, we'll see that the XML is actually the first thing it's waiting for, and then the next parameter is the XPath expression we want to use. So if I add a comma in here, let's go and get that expression we took. The only thing to note about putting this into Power Automate is, because I'm pasting it in, I'll be pasting it in between single quotes. So I don't want this single quote to terminate that string. So I'm just going to duplicate these single quotes to escape them within this text string here, so that when I come back into my flow and I put in between double quotes what I want my text XPath expression to be, that will be accepted as a valid string, and it doesn't finish that text string there. So that's that expression. So hopefully when this runs, we'll now get an array of correct answers. So I'll just click update. Oh, and that expression is invalid, which will be because I've not done the alternative for this if expression. So I'll just add a null at the bottom there this time. Let's try that. Yeah, that's better. So if I publish this, when I look at the select now, I can see I've got this extra property added in only for the question.choice type question. So there's one, there's another, and then for the text field question, it's just null for now, and equally for ranking, it's just null for now. We'll come back to those. But for the first two questions here, so a single choice and a multi-choice question, we've got an array of the correct answers. So here, if we can read the response and see that the users responded correct, we'll give them the point. And in this multi-choice question, if they selected both of these correct answers, then we'll also give them the point for this question too. So the next type of question is question text field. So if I select this whole line and put it into Notepad here, we can see that the grading basis object is, again, it's a JSON string, so we'll need to convert that into an object using the JSON function in our Power Automate expression. And then we're probably not concerned with the IDs, we just want to extract the answer properties, which will give us the correct text values, the respondee or respondor, sorry, can type in if they want to get the points to that question. So we're going to have to amend our flow. So if I go back to edit and click our expression, so this will be the next one if the question type is text field. And remember, from our filter, this will only be short text answers where there is a grading basis. So we want to generate our test XML again, so that we can figure out what the XPath expression is going to be in XPather. But this time it's not choices we want. So we'll add a grading basis object into our XML under root. Sorry, property under root. And to get that, it's going to be question info grading basis. So let's update that. Publish and test. And actually, before we test, just remembered that grading basis here was a JSON string, not an actual object. So if we put in JSON around here, put the bracket in there somewhere, so now that will convert grading basis into an object before putting it in our XML object. So I'll publish again and test. Okay, so this time in our selector, we scroll past our valid answer keys. We've got now in the text field type question another encoded bit of XML. So I'll take that and decode it. I'll take our XML, I'll paste it into XPath and we'll start exploring. So if I start at the root again and then go for grading basis, being careful because XPath is case sensitive. So here it's given me two objects already. I'll just click over to node here so I can see I've got a grading basis, I've got an ID and an answer under each one. So I'm only interested in the answer, and again I want to extract just the text. So when I take this back to Power Automate, I should get an array of the possible correct answers for this text question. So again, I'm going to copy this expression. There's no double quotes here now, which is nice. Do I go back to edit my expression? Again, I need to add XPath. We've got the XML, and we just need to add SPath. We've got the XML, so now we just need to add in the XPath query text string, which is as follows. So nothing to escape. Let's update, publish and test. So now looking at the select output, we should have an answer key in our text field question, and we do, and the possible two correct answers for the text question are now there. So the last one we need to look at is the ranking question. And it looks like here the easiest thing to do might be to just take the grading basis. We've already got an XPath expression for that. There's no sub properties, so there's no answer to look into. So we could just take out that answer part and get the text for each correct answer there. So let's go back to our edit view to implement that. So I should just be able to change this to ranking and take this whole line and replace that line. So we want the grading basis, we just don't need this answer part. So again, let's update, publish and test. Now in our select for the question ranking, we also have an answer key. So these are the IDs of the choices for the question arranged in the right order. So with that, we've got everything we need here to answer a question. We just need to find out for each question what the actual response was from the recipient. And there's one more thing probably worth picking out here before we continue, which is the last bit of information about the actual question we need, which is how many points is it worth. So here back in the editor, I'm going to add another add property. And going right to the end here, I will add on my new property, which is going to be called max points. So I don't get confused later down the line when I've got the actual scored points. And that is going to equal, I'll just take one of these, oops, just take, oh dear, take one of these, and instead of type, I want it to be question info. And I'll close the brackets. I might just quickly tidy up all these closing ifs into one line. Just bring that all down. Click update and publish and test. And here we are in the output of that select. So now we've got this max points property as well. This will be 1 because all the point values were 1. But this will help us more easily access the max points value later on down in the flow. So that's everything we need to know about the question. So we just need to amalgamate into our array here of questions what the actual answer was from the recipient. So we're going to do that again back into our edit view with another select. And the input to this select is just going to be the output from the first. So select one output. And here I'm going to go into text mode again, and we're going to add in another relatively complex expression. So in this expression, we're going to add another property to our existing item. And that property is going to be called answer. So this is the answer the user gave. So what's that answer going to be? If we go back and look at our response action outputs, we can see that all the responses are crammed into this answers object here. So again, this is a JSON string that will need to be converted to an object. If we paste this into Notepad, we can see it's quite long. It looks like there's different things going on for different questions. So again, we're going to have to pull out different versions of this for each type of question. So we start with the question which is of the single choice type. So that was this first question here. I've called it single choice. So the ID of that question in my particular quiz is this bit. So if I just find, I have to search up if I'm already further down. Here we go. So that's the ID. So it's the first answer. Maybe these come through in order, which is nice. So it's the first item in this list that I'm interested in for my text question. So that's just this bit at the top. So we can see that it's got an answer 1 property and it's got the question ID. So we need to look up from the question ID what answer 1 was. So we're going to do that again using XPath. So here again, we need to get, first of all, some XML. So we're going to do property, JSON, blank, curly braces, object. So to that object, we're going to add our root. And root is going to be another add property to blank, name, blank JSON. And to that, we're going to add a property called answers. And what is the value of answers going to be? Well, for that, we need to go back to our other flow of our previous run and the get response action outputs. So here we can see we've got to go into the body of that response, then get value, which is an array of a single item. And within that single item, so the first item, we need to get this answers line. And then this is a JSON string, which we'll need to convert into an actual object. And then we'll XML-ify that, and we'll see if we can get an XPath expression to pick up the answers we need. So let's start in the middle with our dynamic content, which is the body of our get response action. And so then the first thing we said was that we would look for the value property of that, which was an array. So we just want the first one of those. So I can either do that by adding a 0 like this here, or what I might do in this instance is put this within a first. So this gives us the first value, which is one response, and then under that we want to get the answers property. That was a JSON string, so we need to turn that into an object like so. And then hopefully that is that. So if I update this and publish and test, we'll see what we get back. So now in our select output, we have an answer property, which again is giving us a base64 encoded string. So if I have a look at that, I can see that we've got all the answers in XML form returned here. So now we need to try and get the answer1 property for this question ID. So if I copy this question ID, we're going to start at the root level. We'll go for answers, where the property question ID there equals that ID in quotes. So it's found me one result there, and we want the answer1 property of that. And again, we want the text of that node. So that's our expression. There we go, copied. So I'll bring that back into my flow under edit. And I will put that in an XPath expression outside my XML object. So XPath, the first argument is the XML, and then within that, the second argument will be my expression, which is that, and then I'll replace the quotes inside the string with 2 quotes, and I will get the question ID, which in this case is so that's not part of the string, so I will need to break the string in the middle there. Do this on a new line so it's a bit more obvious, but I will need to concatenate this string with the end part, and in the middle I want item, and I think it's just ID, the property ID from this item, which is the question that we want to see here, but we can check that by going back into the select, looking at the outputs, and we can see that, yeah, ID, all lowercase. So the ID for that question, finish off the XPath expression in a concat, and then we close the brackets for the XPath. So if I update that and publish and test, we'll see what happens. So looking at the results, we can see that for our single choice question, we've got an array of 1 answer, which matches our answer key, which is nice. For the multi-choice question, our answer key had an array of 2 items, and here we've got a JSON string, which when expanded would look like this answer key. So for multi-choice actions, it looks like we'll have to do a conversion of that to an object. For the text, the short text question, it looks like this will be fine because we can check to see if the answer is in the answer key. But it will have to be treated slightly differently. And then for the ranking question, this has come back with nothing in the answer box. So it'll be interesting to see if we can figure out why that is first of all. So let's take the ID of that ranking question and go back to XPath and see what we can find. So we paste that in. Well, there's no elements found here, which is probably why we've got nothing in the answer. So let's strip back. So if we get rid of the text part there, the reason why it wasn't providing anything is now clear, and that's because it's not text under this level, it is an array of 4 more objects. So what we need from here is something different entirely. So that's another type of question we'll need to treat differently. So looking back at the results from Select 2, we'll do the easier one first, which is converting this JSON string into a collection of objects, which should hopefully match the answer key format like this. So to do that, let's go back into our flow. Here I might first tidy this up a little bit so that we know we've got our XPath expression, our XML object, and our XPath expression here. If I select those and do control square bracket close, that'll indent that nicely. And in fact, I'll put that bracket up there on the end. So we know that that is our default answer. Will hopefully work for us in 2 of the cases. But first, we need to add another condition to see if the question type is a multi-choice. So looking at the question type for multi-choice, it's question.choice, which is the same as for single choice. The difference here is within question info, we can see choice type is 1 for the single choice and choice type is 2 for the multi-choice question. So here's a condition I prepared earlier for checking that that question info choice type is equal to 2. If it is, then we're going to put our new version in here. So that will be our new version of this XPath expression. And then if it's not the case, then we want the existing version of our XPath expression. And then we'll close that if out there. So the only thing we should need to do here is add a JSON function around the result, because this result was the stringified version of the object. So just by adding a JSON around that, we should, by now publish and test this, hopefully see that we've got an array of answers. Here's the result. So it's failed, and that's because JSON expects its parameter to be a string or an XML, and the provided value is of type array. And that's true. It was an array of 1 object, and the object we wanted was the first and only item in that array. Here it is. So its answer was an array of 2 things, and the first one was the string we wanted. So let's go and fix that in the expression. If I edit this, it's not just the JSON, it's the first result of that XPath expression. So here we are looking at the results, and now the single choice is the same, and the multi-choice has an array of answers which matches the answer key. So now it's time to try and do the hardest bit, which is the ranking question. So I'm going to put another condition I've come up with already to check for that type of question here. So if we find that it's a ranking type question, we'll start with this XPath and build on it. And otherwise, once again, we'll fall back on the existing XPath expression. So we need to now change this bit in order to reflect the ranking style of question. So this is where it gets interesting. First of all, we've just seen before that putting this kind of expression in where we finish at answer 1 gives us back a node set as a result. And within those, we can see that there are order properties, so order 3 for this one, 2, 1, 4. So if we put these in the right order, in theory, we'll have some sort of answer key, and then the key here looks like it might match up with the answer key ID properties we got from the grading basis. But first of all, let's put this expression into our flow and see what comes out. So if I get rid of the text and just leave that as answer 1, I'll update that and publish and test. So here's the result. Now in my answer property for the ranking question, I've got an array of 4. We've seen these before. These are our XML objects, and the content sub property here is a base 64 encoded string, which if I copy and put back into my base 64 decoder, we'll see that it's one of those sub answers. So one of the choices you can make on that question, or one of the answers you have to put into the right order. So we've got 4 of those returned here in the result. So the next one is this. So if I select this bit of base 64, if I paste it on the end, I find that it doesn't like that. It's a malformed input. But if I were to put that in on its own, it's happy with it. So we need to figure out a way of amalgamating these successfully into one big XML object, and then we can feed that into another XPath expression to do something with it. Now, the clue to this is noticing that in all these long base 64 strings, we don't get any equals signs until the very, very end. If I go back to that malformed combination and I replace that inner 2 equals signs with some other characters, I'll just put A for now, we can see that it has actually generated some kind of combination of the two, and in between is some characters it doesn't recognize. So that's not an ideal base 64 string there. But we know if we can replace those characters with something that will convert to a good character that won't affect the overall XML in terms of its validity, then we will be able to combine all these results into one. So we're going to figure this out with the help of a little power app I've built here that converts some text into its base 64 encoded equivalent. So here I've got the word start. You can see that what's actually happening is it's taking each character of that word and it's converting it into binary. So each character becomes 8 bits, so 1 byte of noughts and ones, and then it takes that binary encoded string and encodes it back into base 64. But rather than splitting it into chunks of 8, base 64 chunks the binary into chunks of 6, and each one of those is represented in base 64 by a different character. So this is all well and good where your input text is in groups of 3 characters, because then you get 24 bits, which is also divisible by 6. However, when I start to take text off the end, you'll see that there's not quite 24 in this second piece of the puzzle here, the last 2 letters. So what happens in base 64 is it pads the end with some zeros, and rather than representing this with the base 64 character for 6 0 bits, it adds this specific padding character on the end, which is an equals. So you can see that the letter T here finishes at this point. And even though that's the case, the last 2 zeros, albeit padding in this case still get converted. So this 0, 1 and then 4 zeros still gets converted into Q. And it's only the last 6 digits, which are all padding, that get converted into this equal sign. So that's one equal sign. So what if we take another letter off? Well, then we get a lot of padding at the top. We get the first 2 characters in this base 64 word here, in the base 64 encoded letters, and then we get 2 equal signs. So the challenge here is to figure out what 2 characters we can add in to the missing text here that will result in no padding characters being on the end of our base 64 string, but that won't change any of the preceding encoded characters, and that are compatible with XML. They won't, if we add these characters in the middle, they won't break the existing XML. So for example, if we put a space in, because white space would be fine in between XML nodes, you can see that it's replaced that padding equals there, but it's also changed this character from a G to an I, so that's not what we want. However, in Windows encoding, if we do a new line, which is also acceptable in between nodes in XML, it actually counts as 2 characters. And we're lucky that the carriage return, the first of those 2 characters, has 4 zeros in its binary at the start of that character. So the 4 zeros that were padding originally before I added my new line in, are still zeros. So this character is not changed, but we've replaced our double equals with a 0 and a K. So if we put 0 and a K in place of a double equals sign, we should be able to join these bits of XML together. If we were to come across a situation where we had a single equals character, we can't put a new line because that would go into the next set of 3 characters. But here we can use the space, because the space, the first 2 binary digits of the space converted into binary are zeros. So again, that doesn't change. Here that's a Q, so if we get rid of the space, that's still a Q. So adding a space, I can achieve that by changing a single equals into a lowercase g, and if I have 2 equals to replace, I can replace it with a 0 and a K. So let's test this out with our malformed input here. If I take these 2 equals and replace them with a 0 and an uppercase K, I can see I've combined nicely these 2 XML nodes into pure XML, which I can then feed into another XPath expression. So how do we achieve that in our Power Automate flow? Well, first of all, I'm going to convert this XPath expression result into a string and see what that does. So here's the result. Now for the ranking question, we have a long text string here in the answer property. Copy that all out. And now we need to, so if we just get rid of those quotes at the start and finish, this is what we're looking at. So we basically need to replace everything from start all the way up to the base 64 part here, and then in between each bit of base 64, so there's the equals, we also need to replace this section between that and the next part of the base 64, which is the same as this part, except for it's got the closing quotes and the comma. So then we go all the way to the end, and after the last one, we just have the closing quotes and then the closing curly braces. So I'm going to go away and try and do a lot of replace functions to try and trim all that out, and I'll let you know when I've finished. So here we are in the future. I've added around this existing string part a whole bunch of replaces, which are taking that content type section all the way through to the content and the colon and the opening double quote, replacing that with nothing. The same for the closing double quote and the closing curly brace. and then any commas are coming out, and then the square brackets are coming out, and then lastly I've gone ahead and replaced the double equals with 0k, and I've replaced the single equals after that with the lowercase g. So that should give us the base64 encoding of a whole massive XML object. So the last thing we need to do here is convert that from base64 back into a string with the base64 the string function. So I put that around all of that. That should give me all those XML bits added together, like a bigger version of this. The only problem with this XML is it doesn't all live inside a root object. So we need to concatenate this with the opening root tag, and then lastly with the closing root tag. Close the brackets, and that's our concatenation done. So what I should be able to do is convert this back into XML, and then run an XPath expression on it. Let's first publish this and see what it gives us. So here in the result, and in the ranking question, the answer is now the XML, starting with the root node, is the XML for all the different answers. And we can see that there we've got the ID property, we've got the order property, so it's starting with a 3 here. And then further on down, we've got a description, and this one, which I think is going to be important, the answer key. So really at this stage, it would be good to get these answers into the correct order before we then pick out the key. So let's do that first. So back here in the editor, I'm going to wrap this concatenated string in an XML function. So that will be there. And then secondly, I can turn that XML object into a proper object by using the JSON function. So let's just wrap it in both those and update that to see what happens. So back here in the result, we can see that for the question.ranking type, answer is now an object with a property called root, and under that a property called answer1, and then we've got an array of the possible answers. And looking at this now, it's easier to see that actually potentially what we want to to sort on is this answer order property, which goes 0, 1, 2, 3, rather than the other order property which has this strange value in here. So we'll sort by that property first, and then we will revert to using XPath in order to extract just this key property, and we'll end up with our answer key array. So back in the editor, if we sort this object, well, not the whole object, but the root answer1 property within that, and we'll sort that by answer order. That will give us the sorted answers. And then what we want to do is turn that into XML and use the process we're now familiar with to extract just one property from that. So I've done that already here. So I've built an XML object with a root property and an answers property. The answers property is our sorted list of answers, and then I put that in an XPath expression. And what we want to do now is put in our XPath expression, which is just root answers, get us the key value from each of those answer objects, and just the text back from it. So I won't show you the XML this time because we're familiar with this approach now. But let's test this out in action and see what happens. So an extra comma in there, let's get rid of that. And publish and test. So here we are in the result. And if I go right down to the bottom, there's our ranking question. Here's our answer array. So this is what the user chose, the order they put them in. And here it matches our answer key. So that's proved, because I answered this one correctly, that the answer key was the IDs of the questions in the correct order. So you can see that clearly matches that. So now we've got all our possible answer keys. So we just need to decide for each type of question how we use the answer and the answer keys to score the question. So let's have a look at what we need to do to check these answers. So firstly, in the case of choices, we can see that the answer key and the answer from the user in both cases just needs to be checked to see if it's the same. The only wrinkle in that plan is that if the shuffle options option was turned on for the multi-choice question, what could happen is the answers that the user gave might be correct, but in a different order to the answer key. So for choices, we'll need to sort the answer key and answer arrays before checking that they're the same. For text field questions, we just need to see if the first, because there'll only ever be one, the first answer in the answer array is contained within the answer key array. And then lastly, for the question.ranking type of question, we just need to check that the answer key is equal to the answer, because the answer key is already the answers in the right order, and the answer we sorted in this select to action already. So back in the editor, I've already gone ahead and added another select action here, the last one I promise, and the input to this select is the output of select to. And I've already added in this expression here, which will do exactly what I've just said I wanted to do. So it's adding a property to the existing item called scored points. And if the answer is correct, which this bit is going to test, then we're going to award the maximum points to the user. Otherwise, we're going to give a score of 0, which is how Forms does it. It's all or nothing. And then to check whether the answer is correct, I've got this OR block. So any of these 3 sub-conditions can be true, and each of them is a combination, an AND combination of 2 tests. So the first is, what is the type of question? So if the question is a choice question, we're then checking to see if the sorted answer key is equal to the sorted answer from the recipient. If the question is a text field type question, then we're going to check whether the answer key contains the first item from the answer. And then lastly, if the question type is question.ranking, then we're going to just check that the answer key and the answer arrays are equal. So that's the expression. Let's publish and test, see what happens. So here's the result. And in my select 3 outputs, I've now got the existing item, but also I've got the scored points property. And because I, in this answer, answered all the questions correctly, it should always equal 1, which is the same as the max points. So we've got scored points 1 there, scored points 1 there, scored points 1 there, and lastly for the ranking question, scored points 1. So it looks like that has worked. So the last thing we need to do is sum these up to do a total of the scored points, and then also a total of the maximum points available, and we can feed that back to the parent flow in the response action at the bottom. So back in the editor, we're actually going to use XPath again to do these calculations. So just for now, I'm going to add in a compose action. And in this, I can add an XML expression. So all I've done in this expression here is I've done our usual root property. I've got an answers property under that, just because I've reused something from before. And then the object that's going to fill that in is the output of select3. So let's add that and publish and test, and we'll see what that XML looks like, and we can come up with an XPath expression then to do the summing for us. So what's nice about putting this in a compose action is we don't need to do any conversion from base 64, because the compose takes care of that and has just returned here the full XML output that I need to analyze. So taking this back to XPath, we can start to explore and keep root answers at the top there. We don't need that double slash. Root answers, and we can see that all my answers are included, but what I really want to see now is that scored points property, which I've just added in. So it's pulled all those back. You can see each of them is a node containing a numerical value. So what we can do in XPath is wrap that in a sum function, and it will sum those numbers and give us back the integer 4, which is great. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to take it back to my editor. So back here in the editor, I'm going to overwrite that with my finished XPath expression. So we've got that XML object and our new sum XPath expression is the second part of the function there. And I'm going to publish this now and see what that comes back with. So here's the result, and in that compose we can now see that we have the number 4. Although you might not be able to make it out there, but it's black rather than the kind of green colour you get for number types in Power Automate. So we'll need to wrap that in an int function if we want to return the actual number to the parent float. So let's do that now. So back in the editor, I can get rid of this compose action now. That was just for testing. And in the output, I might get rid of the result property altogether and instead add in 2 number type responses. So the first one's going to be scored points, and the second will be max points. So the expression for scored points is going to be exactly what we just had before, except we're going to wrap it in an int, and that will convert that text string of the number into a number type, so that can go back up to the parent float. And the same with max points, except the only difference in that expression is going to be that instead of scored points in the XPath expression, we've replaced that with the max points property. So let me publish and test this and see what happens. So here we are in the result. So it didn't actually run this step because we're just running a test. We're not actually calling it from a parent flow, but you can see what it would have sent back in the body of the response to the parent flow: scored points 4 and max points 4. So that's great. Let's go test it from the parent flow. Okay, so I'm actually going to test it by submitting another form with all the wrong answers. And hopefully I won't get any points for doing this, but the max points should still be correct. So I'll submit that, go back to my solution and open the parent flow this time. Here we are. So we can actually see this one has failed. So let's click in and have a look. So it's saying it's a bad request. And it's to do with tokens in the trigger outputs. Workflow has connection references. So this is to do with the fact that the child flow, when it's called, is losing the user context. So When we initially set that parent flow up, we didn't have any connections. Now we've got a connection reference built into the flow. So what we need to do to make it work is make sure that the run only users settings are configured so that it's not a connection provided by the run only user, because in the background the flow is triggered by an HTTP request, so the user's connection is lost. So we need to specify which connection we're going to use. Click OK and click Save. Now that's saved, we're going to go back into the parent flow and into that failed run. I'm going to resubmit this request. That still hasn't worked, so I'm going to edit and resave and republish the child flow now that I've set up those run only settings, and see if that does it. So let's resubmit this failed run. It's failed, but with a different error this time. So the input body for trigger manual of type request did not match its schema definition. Expected string, but got integers. So that's probably because I am actually passing an integer in here, and it's asking for a text 1. So if I go into here, I can take the response ID expression. I'm just going to rewrite this so that it's wrapped in a string. Okay, that seems to have worked this time. So now we've run a child flow, we've passed the form ID and the response ID, and in the outputs we will hopefully see scored 0.0, max 0.4. Excellent, so that seems to have worked. So one final test to see if it's working. I'm going to answer the multi-choice correctly and the other questions incorrectly, and see if I get 2 out of 4. So let's submit that. And now if I go to my parent flow, I should hopefully see a new run. Yep, and that's succeeded. It took 1 second. And if I look at the results of the child flow, we've got 2 points out of a possible 4. So brilliant, that is working. So looking back at our challenge goals, we have successfully built a child flow that scores any question type that forms itself will be able to auto score. And we have no manual marking scheme, so this child flow can be run in a parent flow with any form used as the trigger. Lastly, and possibly most importantly, we've used no apply to each loops. This means it will be a minimum in terms of Power Platform API consumption, and it will always be really quick and performant. We managed to do that by using some quite complex XPath expressions, particularly what I like to call the nested select, which is taking the output of an XPath expression that returns a node set, converting that back into a Power Automate object to do more work with. And in this case, we sorted and then we did another XPath expression on that new object. So it was really interesting. I hope you thought so too. Sorry it was so long. I didn't think it was going to be so long when I started. So all that leaves is for me to say, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel, and hopefully then I will produce some more videos as enjoyable and potentially as challenging as this one was. Thanks so much for watching, and see you later, Automator.